Hey guys, tonight we step through a pair of swinging batwing doors that creak like they've got opinions, and you're immediately wrapped in the warm, dusty breath of a Wild West saloon. You smell smoke, old wood, sweat, and something vaguely edible simmering somewhere behind the bar. The floor sticks just enough to remind you you're not in a museum, and the soundscape is all clinks, murmurs, and the low thud of boots that haven't been unlaced in days. This is not the polished, piano-tinkling fantasy you were promised by old movies. This is survival with a side of whiskey, and you probably won't survive this with your modern expectations intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments too, because while you're winding down, someone else is probably just starting their day. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing there hungry, and that's the first thing to understand. Food is not a bonus feature in this saloon. It's the reason half the people inside pushed those doors open in the first place. Hollywood likes to sell you the idea that saloons are about shootouts, poker faces, and piano girls, but most real customers are just tired, underfaced, and looking for something hot that doesn't come from a saddlebag. One mainstream historical fact that still holds up under scrutiny is that many frontier towns had few, if any, standalone restaurants. Saloons filled that gap by necessity, not by culinary ambition. You don't come here chasing flavor, you come here chasing calories. You glance around and notice how many people aren't even holding cards or glasses yet. They're hovering, leaning, watching the bar with the intensity of a modern person watching a microwave countdown. Hunger hangs heavier than cigar smoke. For cowboys, miners, railroad workers, and drifters, this saloon might be the only place today offering a hot meal that didn't require building a fire or chewing something aggressively dry. The saloon keeper knows this. He may not smile, but he knows an empty stomach is good for business. Behind the bar, you catch a glimpse of something bubbling in a pot, and it's not there for decoration. Early saloon food isn't plated or prettied up. It's ladled, slapped, and slid across rough wood. Historians still argue whether most saloons intentionally advertised food, or whether it just organically appeared as a way to keep customers inside longer. But either way, hunger is the quiet engine running the room. You feel it in your own gut now, a sympathetic ache that makes the place suddenly make sense. There's a strange democracy to this hunger. At the same counter, you see a man with a badge worn thin from use. A man with a coat that hasn't been washed since optimism was young, and a man who might be one bad decision away from becoming a legend or a cautionary tale. They're all here for the same reason. Food flattens status out here. Everyone eats, or at least tries to. You notice how low the expectations are. No one is asking what's gluten-free. No one is inquiring about ingredients. The unspoken agreement is simple: if it's hot, filling, and unlikely to kill you immediately, it qualifies as a meal. A quirky but true tidbit from the period is that some saloons didn't even bother listing food options. You ate whatever the pot held that day, and asking questions just marked you as new or annoying. Neither is a survival trait. The saloon itself isn't designed for comfort so much as endurance. Benches are hard, tables scarred, and everything feels temporary, like it could be packed up and moved if the town dries up next month. That impermanence shapes the food too. Meals are built around what keeps, what's cheap, and what can be cooked in bulk without much supervision. You're already starting to understand that this isn't about hospitality, it's about keeping bodies functional. You lean against the bar and feel how smooth the wood has become from thousands of hands doing the same thing over decades. Some of those hands shook from cold, some from nerves, some from withdrawal, and some from simple hunger. The food here isn't comfort food in the modern sense. It doesn't soothe the emotions. It patches holes. It's more like maintenance than pleasure, which is a sentence that really ruins brunch vibes if you think about it too hard. There's also the subtle pressure to drink. Eating alone is rare here. The saloon's real profit comes from alcohol, and food often exists to support that goal. Salty, heavy meals make you thirsty, and thirst sells whiskey. You don't feel manipulated exactly, just guided, like being gently nudged toward another glass while your mouth is full and your guard is down. One of the lighter jokes floating around in frontier newspapers was that the food's real ingredient list was salt, grease, and moral compromise. You take in the room again and realize how quiet it can get between bursts of laughter or argument. People chew thoughtfully, almost reverently. When you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you pay attention to the one in front of you. That focus gives the room a strange calm, even with tension simmering underneath. It's not cozy, but it's grounding. As you stand there, hunger easing slightly just from proximity to food, you start to grasp the core truth of Wild West saloon meals. They are less about tradition and more about adaptation. This isn't a culture built around recipes passed down lovingly through generations. It's built around making do, day after day, with whatever shows up on the supply wagon. Historians still argue whether this constant improvisation slowed the development of a distinct Western cuisine or actually accelerated it in weird, chaotic ways. You rest your elbows on the bar, feeling the day finally catch up to you, and you realize that everything that comes next in this story, beans, beef, pickles, stews, springs from this moment. A room full of tired people, an iron pot, and the shared understanding that eating something, anything, is better than not. The saloon feeds bodies first. Everything else is just noise. You stay where you are, leaning into the bar's edge as the room shifts around you, because hunger doesn't vanish all at once out here. It fades slowly, like a bad memory you don't quite trust yet. The pot behind the bar is still bubbling, and now you start to understand what's most likely inside it. Beans. Always beans. If the Wild West had a national anthem in food form, it would be a ladle scraping the bottom of a bean pot. Beans are everywhere because they have to be. One mainstream historical fact is that dried beans were cheap, lightweight, and nearly indestructible, which made them perfect for frontier life. You could haul them across hundreds of miles, soak them overnight, and turn them into something that passed for a meal with minimal effort. In a saloon, they're often cooked with whatever fat or scraps are available, which means every pot tells a slightly different story depending on who last stirred it and what was left over from yesterday. You watch the bartender scoop a portion into a chipped bowl. The beans are soft, swollen, and glossy with grease. They don't look exciting, but they look serious. This is food that means business. Cowboys fresh off cattle drives recognize this immediately. After weeks of hardtack and salted meat, beans feel like a luxury, even when they're bland. Historians still argue whether beans were actually loved or just tolerated, but when your body's screaming for protein and fiber, affection becomes a secondary concern. Alongside the beans, there's almost always bread. Not fluffy, bakery-fresh bread, but something dense and filling. Cornbread is common, especially in areas influenced by southern cooking. Wheat bread appears where flour shipments are more reliable. You break off a piece and notice how crumbly or tough it can be depending on the day. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some saloon bread was baked so hard it doubled as a makeshift plate, saving the owner from washing dishes. Sustainable, in a deeply unromantic way. You chew slowly, the rhythm of eating syncing with the low hum of the room. Beans and bread together form the backbone of saloon meals because they answer the most urgent question. How do you keep someone upright long enough to buy another drink or come back tomorrow? The answer is starch and bulk. Flavor is optional. Fullness is not. You glance at the faces around you and notice how familiar this meal looks to everyone. There's no ceremony. No one photographs it. people eat with the calm efficiency of those who have done this many times before. You realize that for a lot of these men, this might be their most balanced meal of the day. Beans provide protein and fiber. Bread delivers carbohydrates. If there's a bit of fat mixed in, that's practically gourmet. The beans themselves often simmer all day, sometimes longer. A pot might start in the morning and only be topped up as it empties. Fresh beans are added to old beans, creating a continuous cycle that modern food safety experts would politely call concerning. Yet this practice isn't unusual. Heat and salt are trusted allies, and stomachs here are far more forgiving than yours. Historians still argue whether these endlessly simmering pots contributed to illness or actually helped prevent it by killing off bacteria. And the answer, inconveniently, seems to be both. You take another bite and feel the weight of it settle in your stomach. This is not food meant to energize your mind. It's meant to anchor your body. The effect is grounding, almost sedative, which pairs beautifully with alcohol if your goal is to stay put for a while. One light joke you overhear is that beans are the saloon's real bouncer. Eat enough, and you're not going anywhere fast. There's also a social layer to this simplicity. Beans and bread erase differences in background. A former banker and a former farmhand eat the same thing from similar bowls. No one asks about recipes because there aren't really any. The method is the recipe. Soak, boil, salt, repeat. Variation comes from circumstance, not creativity. You notice a man dunking his bread directly into the bean bowl, unconcerned with appearances. This is efficient eating. Another scrapes the bottom to make sure nothing's wasted. Food scarcity leaves its mark on behavior. You're not just watching people eat, you're watching them manage risk. Hunger is a threat that never fully leaves, even when the bowl is in front of you. As you finish, you understand why beans and bread become shorthand for frontier food in popular memory. They're not glamorous, but they're reliable. They show up when other things don't. They ask little and give a lot. In a world where almost everything feels uncertain, that reliability is worth more than spice. You set the empty bowl aside, stomach warm, and realize this is only the foundation. From here, saloon food branches outward into stranger, saltier, and sometimes more questionable territory. But it all rests on this base: beans to keep you alive, bread to keep you standing, and the quiet agreement that this is enough for now. You don't even realize you've drifted closer to the bar again until your elbow finds a familiar sticky patch, and that's when you notice something curious happening all around you. People aren't just eating beans and bread. They're eating strategically. Small plates appear, vanish, reappear, and none of them seem to come with a price tag. This is where you stumble into one of the saloon's most famous and quietly manipulative traditions: the free lunch. The idea sounds generous, almost charitable, and that's exactly why it works. One mainstream historical fact is that many saloons across the West offered a free lunch to customers, especially during midday hours. The catch, of course, is that you're expected to buy at least one drink. The unspoken rule is simple: food costs money, whiskey costs money. But calling the food free makes the whiskey feel inevitable. You don't question it. No one does. You scan the spread laid out on the counter. It's not lavish, but it's intentional. Salty meats, pickled vegetables, bread, maybe a wedge of cheese if the owner's feeling optimistic. Everything here is designed to make your mouth dry and your throat itchy in that specific way that only alcohol seems qualified to fix. Historians still argue whether the free lunch was primarily a marketing tactic or a genuine attempt to address hunger in rough communities. But the salt levels alone suggest at least a little scheming. You reach for a piece of bread topped with something suspiciously shiny. It's greasy, salty, and gone in 2 bites. Immediately, you want a drink. Not crave, not desire, want. That's the brilliance of it. The free lunch doesn't trick you so much as gently shepherd you toward a decision you were already halfway to making. One light joke floating around later accounts is that the free lunch was the most expensive meal a man could eat, because it never came alone. The food itself rotates depending on supply and location, but the formula remains stable. Salted beef slices, ham ends, sausages that have seen better days, pickles floating in cloudy brine, onions sliced thick enough to make your eyes water just looking at them. These aren't chosen for refinement. They're chosen because salt preserves food and stimulates thirst. It's a beautiful, devious loop. You notice how people hover rather than sit. The free lunch isn't meant to make you comfortable. There are no plates sometimes, just napkins or bare hands. You eat standing up, leaning, perching. This keeps the flow moving and subtly encourages you not to linger too long without ordering another drink. Comfort is bad for business. Mild discomfort, paired with free food, is perfect. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some saloons posted actual rules about the free lunch, including limits on how much one person could eat per drink purchased. Enforcement was casual but firm. Eat too much without drinking enough, and you'd get a look. Eat too much anyway, and you'd get escorted out. The free lunch was generous, but it was not naive. You take another bite, then finally signal for a drink, almost sheepish about how predictable this all feels. The bartender doesn't comment. He's seen this dance thousands of times. Beans fill your stomach, salt fills your mouth, whiskey fills the gap. It's a system refined by trial, error, and human nature. There's also a social dimension unfolding here. The free lunch becomes a meeting ground. You talk while you chew. Deals are floated, jokes traded, rumors exchanged. Food lowers defenses. People who might not sit together at a table will stand side by side at the lunch counter, united by hunger and opportunism. Historians still argue whether the free lunch contributed to the saloon's role as a community hub, or whether it simply accelerated alcoholism under the guise of hospitality. And the answer probably depends on who's doing the arguing. You watch someone clearly trying to game the system, piling food high and nursing a single drink like it's a life raft. The bartender notices too. There's a moment of eye contact, a silent negotiation. Eventually, another drink is ordered. Balance restored. The system holds. What's striking is how expected this all is. No one complains. No one calls it unfair. The free lunch is understood as part of the social contract. You don't come here to get full without paying something. You come to participate in a rhythm that keeps the place alive. Eat, drink, linger, leave. Repeat tomorrow if luck allows. You also notice who avoids the free lunch entirely. Some people sit at tables with their own food, paid for outright. Others eat quickly and leave, uninterested in the implied obligation. The free lunch is an invitation, not a requirement. Accepting it means accepting the rules that come with it. Another light joke passes through the room when someone mutters that the free lunch should come with a warning label. May cause thirst, poor decisions, and extended stays. Laughter ripples, but it's the kind that knows it's laughing at itself. Everyone here understands the deal. That shared understanding makes the saloon feel less chaotic and more managed. You wipe your hands, aware that you've eaten more salt in 10 minutes than your modern doctor would approve of in a week. Yet you don't regret it. The food has done its job. You're warmer, fuller, and strangely more at ease. Hunger no longer sharpens the room's edges. As you step back from the counter, you realize the free lunch is more than a clever trick. It's a reflection of frontier economics where generosity and exploitation blur into something practical. People are hungry. Saloons need customers. The solution feeds both problems at once. You take a slow breath, stomach heavy now, and understand that from this point on, saloon food only gets stranger. The free lunch is the gateway. Beyond it lie jars, pots, and plates that push the definition of meal even further. But for now, you've learned an important lesson in the Wild West. Nothing is truly free, except maybe the hunger that brings you through the door in the first place. You drift along the bar again, fingertips brushing the wood. And this is when your eyes finally land on the jars. They line the counter and back shelves like strange trophies, each one cloudy, each one sealed with the quiet confidence of preservation. This is where saloon food stops, pretending to be fresh, and fully embraces survival science. Pickled everything isn't a joke. It's a strategy. You peer into a jar and immediately regret it a little. Eggs float inside, their whites stained amber from brine, yolks firm and patient. Another jar holds pigs' feet, pale and knuckled, curled like they're trying to remember where they came from. There are cucumbers turned into pickles, onions gone translucent, peppers softened into submission. One mainstream historical fact is that pickling was one of the most reliable ways to preserve food before widespread refrigeration, especially in frontier towns where fresh produce arrived late, bruised, or not at all. You reach for a pickled egg because curiosity is louder than caution. The texture is memorable, springy, slightly rubbery, aggressively salty. It's not unpleasant so much as unapologetic. This food isn't here to charm you. It's here because it lasts. Historians still argue whether pickled foods were consumed more for nutrition or for preservation convenience. But either way, they become a staple simply by refusing to spoil. The jars themselves are often reused endlessly. When one empties, it's refilled with something else and topped off with fresh brine. Labels, if they ever existed, are long gone. You don't ask what's inside. You identify by shape and confidence. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some saloons let regulars reach directly into the jars with their hands, which explains both the toughness of frontier immune systems and why you're suddenly very grateful for modern health codes. Pickled foods serve multiple purposes here. They're cheap, they're salty, they pair beautifully with alcohol. A bite of pickled onion lights up your mouth like a warning flare, and immediately your hand wants to reach for a drink. This is not an accident. The same logic that drives the free lunch drives the pickle jar. Salt sells whiskey. You notice how these jars act as communal food sources. No plates, no portions, just reach and take. There's an unspoken etiquette: don't hog, don't double, dip, don't linger. This shared access reinforces the saloon's social rhythm. You eat standing, chatting, moving. The pickles keep you upright and engaged, not seated and satisfied. There's also something oddly comforting about the predictability of pickled food. Fresh meat might be questionable. Bread varies day to day. But a pickle is a pickle. It tastes the same today as it did last week. In a world where almost everything else feels unstable, that consistency matters more than flavor. You find yourself appreciating it despite yourself. You watch a man drop a pickled egg into a shot glass, splash it with whiskey, and knock the whole thing back like it's a ritual. Someone else swears by pickled pig's feet as a hangover cure, which feels like a prank that got out of hand generations ago. Historians still argue whether these beliefs had any medical basis or were simply born from desperation and bravado. The jars also tell you something about supply chains. Fresh vegetables don't travel well over long distances, but brined ones do. Pickling allows saloons to stretch limited shipments into weeks or months of offerings. It's efficiency disguised as abundance. You see jars half full, jars nearly empty, jars refilled with something new, and realize this is the closest thing the saloon has to inventory management. You take another bite, slower this time, and notice how it wakes you up just enough to stay alert. Pickled food cuts through the heaviness of beans and bread. It resets your palate, sharpens your senses. That balance, heavy food softened by sharp bites, keeps people eating, drinking, and staying longer than they planned. One light joke drifts past you about how pickles are the saloon's way of saying, "You're not done yet." There's also a subtle hierarchy at play. The best pickled items sometimes disappear quickly, claimed by regulars who know the timing. Newcomers get what's left, which is still edible but maybe less appealing. Knowledge matters here. Knowing when the fresh batch comes out can mean the difference between a crisp pickle and a limp one that's seen too much daylight. As you step back, mouth tingling, you realize the pickle jars are doing quiet, constant work. They preserve food, drive drink sales, encourage social movement, and bridge the gap between hunger and habit. They're not glamorous, but they're essential. You wipe your fingers on a napkin that's already seen better days and feel the room settle again. Beans filled you. Bread steadied you. Now pickles have sharpened you. Saloon food isn't random. It's layered, intentional, and surprisingly thoughtful for something that looks so chaotic. You glance once more at the jars, their contents suspended in time, and understand that this briny, communal weirdness is just another adaptation. Out here, if you can make food last, you make people last too. And that's the real point. You don't reach for coffee right away, because the smell alone is doing most of the work. It's thick in the air now, darker than the smoke, heavier than the whiskey. Somewhere behind the bar, a battered pot sits directly on heat that never quite turns off, and what's inside it could politely be described as coffee. Though politely isn't really the frontier's thing. This is the drink that keeps the saloon awake when it should absolutely be sleeping. You finally accept a cup, and the weight of it surprises you. The mug is thick, chipped, and hot enough to make you reconsider your life choices. One mainstream historical fact is that coffee was one of the most widely consumed non-alcoholic beverages in the American West, especially among people who needed to stay alert through long nights. Gamblers, night shift workers, and anyone trying not to pass out face first into a poker hand. You take a sip and immediately understand why no one drinks this for pleasure. It's bitter, burnt, and intense in a way that feels almost personal. This coffee has been boiled, reboiled, and possibly threatened with violence. Grounds float freely, unconcerned with your expectations. Sugar helps, but only in the way a bandage helps a broken fence. Historians still argue whether frontier coffee was intentionally brewed this strong, or whether it was simply the result of cheap beans and endless reheating. But either way, the effect is unmistakable. The pot itself rarely empties. Like the beans earlier, coffee exists in a near-continuous state. Fresh water and grounds are added as needed, often without cleaning out what came before. The result is a rolling blend of old and new that builds character and possibly immunity. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some people claimed you could tell how long a saloon had been operating by the color of its coffee pot, which feels both poetic and deeply concerning. You notice who drinks it. Not everyone. Cowboys on a short stop tend to skip it in favor of something stronger. But gamblers cling to coffee like a life raft. You see one man nursing a cup with shaking hands, eyes locked on the table, as if blinking might cost him everything. Coffee lets him keep playing, keep hoping, keep pretending fatigue isn't catching up. There's an odd respect for coffee here. It's not mocked the way some food is. It's treated as a tool. You don't sip it slowly for flavor, you take it like medicine. One light joke floats by when someone says the coffee's strong enough to wake the dead and annoy the living. And no one disagrees. You realize coffee also serves as a social signal. Ordering it says you're staying. You're committing to the night. It tells the bartender you're not done, not drifting out into sleep or sobriety anytime soon. In that way, it's as much a declaration as a beverage. You take another swallow, wincing slightly, and feel the warmth spread. It cuts through the heaviness of beans and the fog of alcohol, creating a strange balance that keeps you upright. Coffee and whiskey coexist here not as opposites, but as collaborators. One keeps you sharp, the other keeps you brave. Together, they keep you at the table longer than you probably should be. Historians still argue whether coffee houses or saloons played a bigger role in shaping frontier social life, but in towns like this, the distinction barely exists. The saloon absorbs both roles. It's a place to wake up, stay awake, and forget how tired you are. Coffee makes that possible. You glance into the pot again and notice the surface barely ripples, as if it's achieved some kind of simmering equilibrium. The smell clings to your clothes, your hair, your thoughts. You know you'll still taste it later, whether you want to or not. As the night stretches on, coffee quietly holds the room together. Without it, conversations would slur sooner, games would end earlier, and the saloon would empty faster. It's the unsung backbone of late frontier life, keeping eyes open and hopes alive one bitter cup at a time. You set the mug down, fingers buzzing slightly, and feel the room sharpen around you. Hunger eased, thirst managed, fatigue postponed. Saloon food and drink aren't about indulgence, they're about control. And coffee, brutal as it is, might be the most honest thing served here. You feel brave enough now to look toward the cutting board, and that's when meat enters the picture. Beef, specifically, though that word is doing a lot of heavy lifting. A slab lands with a dull thump, and you immediately understand that freshness is a flexible concept out here. Beef is the dream protein of the West, the symbol everyone talks about, but the reality is tougher, chewier, and occasionally mysterious. One mainstream historical fact is that cattle drives flooded frontier towns with beef, especially in boom periods, making it one of the more accessible meats in saloons compared to cities back east. That doesn't mean it was good beef. You watch as a steak is slapped onto a hot surface with little ceremony, cooked quickly, aggressively, and served without apology. Tenderness is not part of the promise. You take a bite and work your jaw like it's training for something. The meat resists. It tastes fine, salty, smoky, maybe a little metallic, but the texture demands focus. This is beef that's traveled. Sometimes it's fresh from nearby herds. Sometimes it's been salted, dried, or stored just long enough to make you stop asking questions. Historians still argue whether most saloon beef came directly from local cattle or through early meat distribution networks tied to railroads and packing houses, and the answer changes depending on the decade and the town. You notice how beef is treated more as fuel than cuisine. There's no garnish, no sides beyond what's already on the counter. If you're lucky, you get beans alongside it. If you're really lucky, the cook knows how to cut against the grain. If not, well, you'll develop jaw strength. A quirky tidbit from the period is that some saloons tenderized beef by pounding it with whatever was handy. Mullets, bottles, sometimes the flat of a cleaver, resulting in steaks that looked like they'd already lost a fight. It didn't always help, but it did send a message. Effort was made. You also realize beef isn't constant. When cattle aren't nearby or prices spike, beef disappears or shrinks. Portions get smaller. Quality dips. You might be eating older cuts or meat that's been preserved longer than ideal. Out here, consistency is a luxury. There's a certain pride attached to beef, though. Men brag about eating steak the way others brag about victories. It's tied to identity, to the myth of abundance. Even when it's tough, eating beef feels like participating in the legend. One light joke passes by when someone says the steak's so hard it might still be alive. And laughter ripples through the room because everyone understands exaggeration as coping. You chew slowly, appreciating the calories if not the finesse. Beef sticks with you. It anchors you the way beans do, but with a different weight. Protein brings a sense of strength, even if it's psychological. In a life where physical labor defines worth, meat matters. You watch how the bartender cook handles it. Fast, efficient, minimal waste. Fat is saved. Bones are set aside. Nothing is thrown out casually. Historians still argue whether saloon kitchens wasted less food than urban restaurants, but watching this, you suspect necessity sharpened efficiency. As you finish, jaw tired but stomach satisfied, you understand that beef in a saloon is about proximity and timing. When the herds are close and the knives are sharp, it's a feast. When they're not, it's a challenge. Either way, it's eaten without complaint, because complaining doesn't make the meat softer. You wipe your mouth and feel the night settle deeper around you. Beans taught you survival. Pickles taught you preservation. Coffee taught you endurance. Beef teaches you reality. The West feeds you, but it doesn't coddle you. And somehow, that makes the meal feel earned. You don't always get beef, and when you don't, the menu quietly gets more creative. You notice it first when someone sets down a plate that doesn't smell like cattle at all. It's leaner, sharper, wilder somehow. This is where the frontier starts improvising, and game meat steps into the gap left by missing herds and empty supply wagons. One mainstream historical fact is that wild game played a significant role in frontier diets, especially in regions where cattle were scarce or expensive. Deer, rabbit, elk, antelope, and even bison make their way into saloon kitchens, not because they're exotic, but because they're available. Hunters, ranch hands, and sometimes the saloon owners themselves supply the meat. If it walks nearby and can be brought down, it's a potential dinner. You taste venison and immediately notice the difference. It's leaner than beef, with a slightly sweet, iron, rich flavor that feels closer to the land itself. It's also easier to overcook, and many saloons absolutely do. Game meat isn't forgiving. Cook it too long and it turns dry and stubborn. Cook it just right, and it feels like a small miracle. Historians still argue whether frontier cooks actually preferred game meat or simply tolerated it as a necessity, but the care you see taken with some cuts suggests at least a grudging respect. Rabbit shows up often, especially in lean times. It's quick to cook, easy to sauce, and mild enough to please most people. You watch a plate go by with small portions, bones visible, reminding you that this isn't a meal for show. You eat around the bones, fingers greasy, mind relaxed. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some saloons advertised fresh game, not as a luxury, but as reassurance that the meat hadn't been sitting around for weeks. Then there's bison, though by the later frontier years it's already becoming rare. When it appears, it's often older meat, tougher, deeply flavored. Eating it carries a strange weight, even if no one says it out loud. You're aware that this animal once covered the plains in numbers hard to imagine now. One light joke passes through the room when someone says the meat's tough because it's tired of being hunted. And laughter follows, uneasy but real. Game meat also brings unpredictability. Supply changes daily. A good hunt means a full pot, a bad one means beans again. You notice how saloons adapt quickly, switching offerings without explanation. No printed meanness, no apologies. What's available is what's available. There's pride in serving game, too. It signals connection to the land and self-reliance. You're not just eating, you're participating in a local ecosystem. That sense of immediacy, of today's hunt becoming tonight's meal, adds a freshness you haven't felt yet, even when the meat itself is chewy. Historians still argue whether reliance on game meat accelerated wildlife depletion or whether it was industrial hunting that did the real damage. Sitting here, chewing slowly, you realize the truth probably isn't neat. Survival pressures don't leave much room for conservation ethics. You finish the plate, hands messy, stomach warm, and feel a different kind of satisfaction. This food isn't romantic, but it's honest. It tastes like circumstance. In the saloon, game meat fills the spaces where systems fail, reminding you that the Wild West feeds itself however it can, and expects you to adapt right along with it. You think you understand frontier bread now, but then someone sets down a biscuit and quietly challenges that assumption. It looks harmless enough, round, pale, maybe even soft. But the moment you break it open, you realize this is a gamble. Bread in the Wild West is a spectrum, and biscuits, hardtack, and everything in between occupy its most dangerous range. One mainstream historical fact is that biscuits were a staple in frontier cooking because they required few ingredients: flour, fat, salt, and some form of leavening if you were lucky. In saloons, biscuits are often baked fresh daily, sometimes more out of habit than quality control. You bite in and brace yourself. Sometimes they're tender and flaky. Other times they're dense enough to make you nostalgic for beans. Hardtack lurks in the background of this bread universe like a cautionary tale. It's not always served directly in saloons, but it influences everything. Hardtack, those famously tough, long-lasting crackers, define the outer limit of what qualifies as bread, made to survive months or years. They're nearly indestructible. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some people joked hardtack was issued once and eaten forever, because no one ever finished it. You dunk a biscuit into coffee instinctively. This is learned behavior, passed down without explanation. Dry bread demands liquid. That liquid might be coffee, beans, or gravy if you're fortunate. Dunking isn't sloppy here, it's efficient. It turns something borderline edible into something comforting. You notice how bread functions as more than food. It's a utensil, a sponge, a filler. It stretches meals, absorbs flavors, and quiets hunger between bites of meat. In saloons, bread often arrives without ceremony, sometimes uncut, sometimes already torn. Portions aren't measured. You take what you need and hope there's more. Historians still argue whether frontier bread was nutritionally sufficient or merely a stopgap that kept people moving without truly nourishing them. Watching how quickly it disappears, you suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle. Bread doesn't fix exhaustion, but it delays it. You chew thoughtfully, teeth doing more work than they'd like, and feel a strange appreciation for this imperfect staple. Bread here isn't about pleasure, it's about endurance. It's something solid in a life that rarely is. One light joke drifts by about biscuits being weapon grade, and someone taps one against the bar to prove a point. As you swallow, you realize that every crumb tells a story of scarcity, ingenuity, and lowered expectations. And somehow, that makes the bread taste better than it should. You smell it before you see it, a deep, comforting aroma that cuts through smoke and sweat like a promise. Somewhere near the back, a large pot sits low and steady, its contents thick enough to bubble instead of splash. This is the chili pot, and it's the closest thing the saloon has to a living organism. It's always there, it's always cooking, and no one can quite remember when it started. One mainstream historical fact is that stews and chili-style dishes were common in frontier saloons because they were efficient, flexible, and forgiving. You could throw in meat scraps, beans, onions, peppers, and spices if you had them, then let time do the rest. Chili in particular becomes a staple in the Southwest and Texas-influenced regions, shaped by Mexican culinary traditions and frontier practicality. You peer into the pot and see layers rather than ingredients. Dark red broth, softened beans, shreds of meat that no longer remember what animal they came from. You take a bowl and feel the heat through the ceramic. The first bite is rich, smoky, and deeply satisfying in a way nothing else so far has been. This isn't just filling, it's comforting, which feels almost rebellious out here. The secret, you realize, is continuity. The pot rarely empties. When it gets low, more ingredients go in. Fresh meat joins old broth. New beans mingle with yesterday's spices. Historians still argue whether these perpetual stews were restarted regularly or simply kept going indefinitely. And the unsettling truth is that both happened depending on the place and the person in charge. You notice how people talk about the chili with a strange mix of pride and superstition. Some swear it tastes better the longer it cooks. Others claim it's stronger on certain days, like it has moods. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some saloons named their chili pots, as if acknowledging that something fed daily eventually earns an identity. You eat slowly, savoring the depth. Chili hides imperfections well. Tough meat softens. Questionable cuts disappear into the whole. It's forgiving food for unforgiving circumstances. One light joke floats by when someone says the chili's been cooking so long it knows all our secrets. And laughter follows, warm and easy. You also notice how chili encourages people to sit. Unlike pickles or bread, this demands a bowl and a moment. Conversations stretch, shoulders relax. The pot doesn't just feed bodies, it slows the room down. In a place built on motion and noise, that matters. Historians still argue whether chili as we know it today truly originated in these frontier pots or was later romanticized into existence. But sitting here, spoon in hand, the debate feels academic. This is chili enough. It's hearty, spicy when you're lucky, and always warm. You finish the bowl feeling genuinely nourished, not just patched up. The chili pot hums quietly behind you, ready for the next ladle. Out here, permanence is rare. But as long as that pot keeps simmering, there's something steady to come back to. And that, more than flavor, is why it never empties. You're halfway through another slow breath when someone slides a plate past you and your brain takes a second to catch up with your eyes. Shells, wet shine, a smell that absolutely does not belong hundreds of miles from the ocean. Oysters, out here, in a dusty, landlocked saloon. You blink because this feels like a trick. And yet one mainstream historical fact is that oysters were surprisingly common in Wild West saloons, even in towns nowhere near the coast. Thanks to expanding railroad networks and ice-packed shipping, oysters could be harvested, stored cold, and transported inland faster than you'd expect. They arrive tired, but intact, like travelers who've seen too much and kept going anyway. You lean closer, equal parts intrigued and suspicious. These are not dainty, lemon-garnished oysters. They're served raw, fried, or stewed, often with minimal ceremony. Sometimes they're called prairie oysters, which is deeply misleading and occasionally a practical joke. Real oysters, though, are prized because they feel luxurious. Eating one makes you feel briefly connected to somewhere else, somewhere wetter, cooler, and less dusty. You take one raw because curiosity keeps winning tonight. It's cold, briny, and oddly refreshing after all the beans and meat. The contrast is startling. Historians still argue whether inland oysters were safe to eat by modern standards. But at the time, ice and speed were considered sufficient safeguards. And honestly, you're already committed to this experience. Turning back now feels pointless. Fried oysters are more forgiving. Braided, dropped in hot fat, and served quickly, they hide their journey well. You bite into one and get crunch, then softness, then salt. Comfort food, frontier style. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some saloons advertised oysters specifically to attract wealthier customers, using them as a signal that the town was connected and civilized, not just another stop on the edge of nowhere. You notice how oysters change the mood. People talk about them, they comment, they compare notes. Food this unexpected becomes a conversation starter. One light joke floats by when someone says the oysters traveled farther than most folks in the room, and no one argues. There's also a sense of urgency around them. Oysters don't linger. They're eaten fast, before doubt has time to settle in. You don't poke at them like pickles or sip them like chili. You commit or you don't. That decisiveness fits the saloon's rhythm perfectly. Historians still argue whether oysters' popularity declined mainly due to over-harvesting or changing tastes. But sitting here, you can see how fragile their place on the menu is. They rely on rail schedules, ice supplies, and confidence. Miss one link, and they vanish. You wipe your mouth, amused and a little impressed. Oysters in the Wild West feel like a magic trick. Proof that even out here, the world is bigger than it looks. And for a moment, the saloon feels less isolated, connected by rails and ice to distant shores you may never see. The plate empties quickly. The surprise fades. Hunger settles back into its familiar shape, and the room slides on, as it always does, toward the next thing that keeps people here a little longer. You start to notice something that's been hiding in plain sight this whole time. There is no kitchen, or rather, there is no separate kitchen in the way your modern brain expects one. The heat, the food, the drinks, they all orbit the same person. The bartender, the barkeep, the human hinge holding this entire place together. One mainstream historical fact is that in many Wild West saloons, the bartender also acted as the cook, server, cashier, and sometimes bouncer. Specialization is a luxury of stability, and stability is in short supply out here. You watch him move with practiced efficiency, one hand pouring whiskey, the other flipping meat or stirring a pot without looking. It's multitasking born of necessity, not ambition. You realize how close everything is. The grill is within arm's reach of the taps. The coffee pot sits near the bottles. Food and drink aren't separate categories here. They're part of the same survival loop. If you want to eat, you're standing where people drink. If you want to drink, food is right there, nudging you toward another bite. Historians still argue whether this layout was intentional design or simply the result of cramped buildings and limited resources. But the effect is undeniable. The bartender knows everyone's habits. Who eats before drinking? Who drinks before eating? Who pretends they're just here for food? He doesn't judge. Judgment wastes energy. Instead, he manages flow of people, of plates, of mood. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some bartenders developed reputations specifically for their food, drawing customers who tolerated mediocre liquor just to get a decent meal. You watch him slice meat quickly, portions uneven but generous enough. He's not measuring, he's reading the room. Big guy, hard day, extra cut. Familiar face, regular drinker, standard scoop. This isn't hospitality training. It's instinct sharpened by repetition. One light joke muttered nearby is that the bartender knows your appetite better than your mother ever did, and judging by the nods, that feels uncomfortably accurate. Food also gives the bartender leverage. If things get tense, a plate can appear as a distraction. If someone's had too much, food slows them down. Beans, bread, chili. These aren't just meals, they're tools. You realize the bartender isn't just feeding people, he's regulating them. Historians still argue whether bartenders held real social power in frontier towns or simply acted as service workers. But standing here, you feel that power in subtle ways. He controls access. He decides who eats, when and how much. In a place where hunger is constant, that matters. You notice how little is wasted. Scraps go back into pots, fat is saved, bones are set aside. The bartender treats food like something precious, even when it's rough. That care carries through the room, encouraging people not to waste either. As you step back, you realize the saloon doesn't run on recipes or menus. It runs on this one person's ability to juggle hunger, thirst, and human behavior at the same time. And somehow, night after night, it works. You start to notice who isn't standing behind the bar, and that absence is as telling as anything you've eaten tonight. The food keeps coming, the pots keep simmering, but much of that labor traces back to spaces just out of view. Back rooms, side kitchens, boarding house stoves. This is where women quietly shape the saloon's menu, influence its profits, and rarely get credit for either. One mainstream historical fact is that while many saloons barred women from drinking areas, women frequently worked as cooks, laundresses, boarding house operators, and food suppliers connected to those same saloons. You might not see them leaning on the bar, but you're absolutely eating their work. The beans taste consistent because someone made sure they were soaked. The bread exists because someone baked it earlier. The chili keeps going because someone restarted it when no one was watching. You picture the rhythm of it. Early mornings, heavy pots, heat before the day even starts. Cooking in frontier towns isn't glamorous, it's relentless. Women who cook for saloons often do so as part of a larger arrangement. Running a boarding house, feeding workers, supplementing income in a place where options are limited. Food becomes leverage, stability, and survival rolled into one. There's power in that, even if it's subtle. A good cook can make or break a saloon's reputation. People talk. Word travels fast in small towns. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some saloons advertised home-style cooking without naming the cook, letting customers assume comfort while keeping the labor invisible. You eat another bite and realize how intentional that invisibility is. You also notice that some women do appear in the saloon space itself, often framed by stereotypes. dance hall girls, servers, entertainers. But even then, food is part of their role. Serving meals, clearing plates, keeping people fed enough to stay, but not so full they leave. Historians still argue whether these women wielded more influence than records suggest, or whether their power was always tightly constrained by social norms, and the truth likely shifts town by town. You overhear a story about a cook who refused to work for a particular saloon after a dispute. Business dropped, not immediately, but steadily. Hunger is patient, and so is loyalty. People follow good food, even if they don't consciously admit it. One light joke passes through the room about how the real boss of the saloon never shows her face, and it lands because it's close enough to truth to sting. Food also gives women a kind of authority that's harder to challenge. You can argue with a bartender. You can fight a gambler. But you don't insult the person who feeds you, especially when alternatives are scarce. That quiet respect hums beneath the noise, rarely acknowledged, always present. As you sit with this realization, the saloon feels different. Less like a purely male space, more like a layered ecosystem held together by unseen labor. The meals you've eaten tonight didn't just happen. They were planned, prepared, and protected by people whose names history often forgets. You finish the last bite slowly, feeling the weight of it, not just in your stomach, but in your understanding. The Wild West saloon runs on hunger, alcohol, and bravado, sure. But it also runs on steady hands in hot kitchens, shaping the menu and, quietly, the town itself. You're still chewing when a flavor sneaks up on you that doesn't quite belong to the rhythm you've learned so far. There's spice here, but not the blunt salt of pickles or the slow heat of chili. This tastes layered, familiar, but from somewhere else. And that's when it clicks. The saloon menu isn't just frontier survival food. It's a crossroads. One mainstream historical fact is that the American West was deeply shaped by immigration, and saloon food reflected that long before anyone bothered to write it down. Mexican, Chinese, German, Irish, and Italian influences all seep into what's being cooked, especially in towns tied to mining, railroads, or border trade. You're not just eating Western food. You're eating adaptations of recipes carried across oceans and borders, reshaped by scarcity. You notice tortillas replacing bread in some places, especially closer to the Southwest. Beans suddenly taste different when they're cooked with chilies, garlic, and unfamiliar spices. Mexican vaqueros and laborers bring methods that prioritize flavor even when ingredients are limited. You taste it and realize how much depth can come from knowing what to do with very little. Historians still argue whether Anglo-frontier cooking borrowed intentionally from Mexican traditions or simply absorbed them through proximity and necessity, but the result is undeniable. Then there's the influence you don't always see, only taste. Chinese cooks, often hired for railroad camps and mining towns, bring techniques that change everything quietly. Stir-frying scraps, using sauces to stretch meat, making the most of vegetables others might discard. You might not see chopsticks in the saloon, but you feel the efficiency in the food. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some mystery stews, praised for their richness, were actually influenced by Chinese cooking methods, even if no one said it out loud. You hear German accents near the bar and notice sausages that taste different from the usual saloon fare. Heavier seasoning, firmer snap. These immigrants bring a culture of meat preservation, smoking, curing, fermenting, that fits perfectly with frontier needs. Suddenly, sausage isn't just filler, it's reliable protein with a personality. Irish and Eastern European influences show up too, especially in bread and stews, thicker soups, root vegetables. Meals designed to warm you from the inside out. You recognize the comfort immediately, even if you can't name it. One light joke passes through the room about how everyone claims the food tastes like home, even though home means 5 different places depending on who's talking. What strikes you most is how little credit anyone gives these influences. The food just exists, shaped by hands that pass through and move on. Recipes aren't written. Techniques aren't labeled. They're learned by watching, tasting, copying. Historians still argue whether the West developed a true culinary identity or remained a patchwork of borrowed traditions. But sitting here, you suspect the patchwork is the identity. You take another bite slower now, appreciating the complexity hiding under the grease. The saloon doesn't advertise these flavors. It doesn't celebrate diversity. It just feeds people using whatever knowledge happens to be nearby. And somehow, that makes the food richer than anything planned. As the night settles, you realize the menu is a map. Every dish hints at where people came from, what they brought with them, and what they were willing to adapt. The Wild West doesn't erase cultures. It blends them one meal at a time, until no one remembers where the line was in the first place. You don't expect sweetness here, and that's why it catches you off guard when it finally appears. After all the salt, grease, and heat, something soft and sugary feels almost out of place, like laughter during a funeral. Desserts in the Wild West saloon are rare, not because people don't want them, but because sugar, fruit, and time are all expensive luxuries. One mainstream historical fact is that desserts on the frontier were limited by access to refined sugar and fresh ingredients, making sweet treats occasional rather than expected. When they do appear, it's usually in the form of pie or cake, baked in advance and guarded carefully. You spot a pie cooling on a shelf, its crust uneven, its filling dark and thick. You take a slice and taste something familiar. Apples, maybe dried and rehydrated, or berries preserved months ago. The sweetness is muted, less aggressive than what you're used to, and somehow that makes it better. It feels earned. Historians still argue whether frontier desserts were primarily morale boosters or simply a way to use surplus ingredients before they spoiled. But sitting here, the morale boost is undeniable. Cake appears even less often, usually tied to a specific event, a holiday, a successful season, someone's birthday. When it does, it's simple. No frosting towers, no decoration beyond maybe a dusting of sugar. You eat it slowly, aware that this isn't something you'll see again soon. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some saloons charged extra for dessert not because it cost more, but because people were willing to pay for the novelty. You notice how people react to sweets. Conversation softens, shoulders relax. There's a childlike focus that appears even in the hardest faces. One light joke drifts by when someone says the pie's almost too good for this place. And the laughter that follows is gentler than before. Dessert changes the pacing of the room. Meals stretch. People linger just a little longer. Sugar does what it always does. Slows things down, smooths edges. In a space built around alcohol and urgency, that's powerful. Historians still argue whether desserts played any significant role in saloon culture. But watching the way this pie disappears, you suspect it mattered more than records suggest. Sweetness reminds people of something else. Homes left behind, moments that weren't about survival. You finish the last bite reluctantly, feeling the night soften around you. The saloon returns to its usual rhythm, but something lingers. A reminder that even here, in all this grit, there's room for a little comfort. You don't think about cleanliness until something makes you think about cleanliness. And out here that thought arrives late, if at all. As you set your empty plate aside, you notice the same rag being used to wipe the counter, a spill, and someone's hands in quick succession. No one flinches. This is just how things are. Food safety in a Wild West saloon exists more as optimism than practice. One mainstream historical fact is that germ theory was not widely understood or applied in everyday life until the late 19th century, and even then it spread unevenly across frontier regions. You're eating in a time when people blame bad air, bad luck, or bad morals for illness, not bacteria. Cleanliness is judged by appearance and smell, not microscopic threats no one can see. You watch the chili ladle dip again and again into the same pot. sometimes resting on the rim, sometimes not. Meat is cut on boards that have seen generations of knives. Hands move from money to food without pause. And yet, people keep eating. They have to. Hunger doesn't wait for ideal conditions. Historians still argue whether frontier populations developed stronger immune systems due to constant exposure, or whether illness was simply underreported and normalized, and the truth likely lives uncomfortably in between. Food preservation methods do some of the heavy lifting here. Salt, smoke, heat, and alcohol act as accidental safeguards. Pickling kills some threats, boiling helps others. Whiskey doubles as both drink and disinfectant in popular imagination. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some people genuinely believed strong alcohol could kill sickness inside the body, which explains both drinking habits and confidence levels. You notice how people trust their senses completely. If it smells off, they don't eat it. If it tastes strange, they stop. That's the system. No labels, no expiration dates, just instinct and experience. One light joke floats by when someone says, "If it didn't kill me yesterday, it won't kill me today." And the nods suggest that's considered sound logic. There's also an acceptance of risk baked into every bite. Life out here is already dangerous. Adding food anxiety on top of everything else would be exhausting. So people don't. They eat, they hope, and they move on. Food safety becomes less about prevention and more about resilience. Historians still argue whether poor sanitation significantly impacted life expectancy in frontier towns compared to eastern cities. But sitting here, you realize the question misses something. Survival here isn't about avoiding all risk. It's about choosing which risks are worth taking. Eating is non-negotiable. You finish your meal, stomach intact, and feel a quiet gratitude, not for cleanliness, but for luck. Out here, that counts for more than standards. And as the night rolls on, no one gives food safety another thought, because tomorrow will bring hunger again, whether they're ready or not. You don't choose your table so much as drift into it, and only once you've settled do you realize who you're sharing space with. A badge catches the lamplight on one side. On the other, a man whose coat hangs just a little too loose, whose eyes track the room instead of his plate. Out here, meals don't come segregated by morality. Lawmen and outlaws eat the same food, sometimes inches apart, bound by hunger and an unspoken truce that lasts exactly as long as dinner. One mainstream historical fact is that Wild West saloons functioned as neutral ground more often than popular stories suggest. Marshals, sheriffs, bounty hunters, gamblers, and criminals all used the same spaces because there simply weren't alternatives. Food made that coexistence possible. It's hard to start a fight when your mouth is full and your hands are busy with a bowl. You notice how the tone changes when food arrives. Hands that hovered near holsters relax, shoulders drop. Even eye contact softens. Eating demands attention, and attention pulls energy away from aggression. Historians still argue whether saloons actually reduced violence by offering food, or whether they merely delayed it. But in moments like this, delay feels like peace. The lawman eats methodically, beans first, then meat, then bread, like he's following a checklist. The man across from him eats faster, as if time is a resource he's always running out of. You sit between them, aware of the tension but also of how fragile it feels right now. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some sheriffs intentionally ate in saloons at peak hours, believing their visible presence discouraged trouble. Whether that worked or just made things more interesting is still up for debate. Food also levels conversation. Small talk happens here that wouldn't happen elsewhere. Comments about the chili, complaints about tough meat, jokes about coffee that could wake the dead. One light joke passes when someone says the stew's so thick you could lose a warrant in it. And even the badge holder smirks. For a moment, everyone is just tired and hungry. You realize meals create plausible deniability. A man wanted for something can claim he's just eating. A lawman can claim he's just passing through. No one presses too hard while plates are still warm. Historians still argue whether this informal truce was an understood social rule or simply a byproduct of shared necessity, but it's followed more often than not. As plates empty, the room subtly tightens again. Chairs scrape, postures shift. Food's calming influence fades, replaced by whatever people brought in with them. You feel it happen like a weather change. Eating didn't solve anything, it just gave everyone a pause. You finish your meal quietly, aware that you've witnessed something rare and fragile. In the Wild West, sharing food doesn't make you allies, but it can make you human to each other, if only for the length of a bite. And sometimes, that's enough to get through the night. You feel the contrast the moment someone starts talking about camp food, because suddenly the saloon feels almost luxurious by comparison. A roof, a bench, food served hot without you having to tend a fire or watch the horizon. You lean back and listen, and the difference between trail rations and saloon meals sharpens into focus. One mainstream historical fact is that most cowboys and trail workers spent weeks or months eating the same limited set of foods, while on the move beans, coffee, salted meat, and hardtack cooked over open fires with minimal equipment. Camp food is functional to the extreme. It keeps you alive, not happy. The saloon, by contrast, feels indulgent simply because someone else did the cooking. You imagine the trail now. Dust everywhere. Wind that never quite stops. A chuck wagon rattling behind the herd, its contents precious and predictable. Meals are timed around daylight and labor, not appetite. You eat because it's time, not because you want to. When someone mentions that the beans always tasted faintly of smoke and grit, no one argues. Back in the saloon, the same beans suddenly feel elevated. They're served in bowls instead of tin plates. They're eaten sitting down. There's a sense of pause. That alone changes everything. Historians still argue whether saloon food was nutritionally superior to camp food, or whether the difference was mostly psychological. But sitting here warm and off your feet, the psychological part feels enormous. Camp bread is often worse too. Hardtack biscuits baked too fast or too slow. Bread that's already stale before it cools. Dunking becomes mandatory. Teeth are tested daily. A quirky tidbit from the era is that cowboys sometimes broke hardtack with rifle butts before soaking it, which says a lot about both the bread and the lifestyle. You realize saloon meals aren't just about ingredients, they're about relief. Relief from responsibility. Relief from vigilance. On the trail, every meal requires effort and attention. In the saloon, you can let your guard down just enough to chew slowly. One light joke floats by when someone says the best seasoning in town is not having to cook it yourself. And laughter follows because it's painfully accurate. You notice how cowboys eat differently when they're in town. Slower, more deliberate. They savor textures they don't get on the trail. Even bad food tastes better when you didn't have to haul it, light it, or clean up after it. Historians still argue whether frequent saloon meals actually improved long-term health for trail workers or simply offered temporary comfort. But comfort matters more than statistics when you're exhausted. You finish your plate feeling not just fed, but restored in a small, meaningful way. As the conversation drifts on, you understand why saloons draw people in so powerfully. They aren't just watering holes. They're places where survival eases into something like living, even if only for one meal at a time. You feel it shift before anyone says it out loud. The food changes, subtly at first, then unmistakably. Plates look a little fuller. Ingredients feel a little less desperate. This is what happens when the railroad finally reaches town, and the saloon menu quietly rides in on steel rails and ice. One mainstream historical fact is that the expansion of railroads across the American West dramatically altered food availability. Trains didn't just bring people and mail, they brought refrigerated cars, canned goods, packaged flour, and ingredients that once felt impossibly distant. You don't see the tracks from your seat, but you taste them in the meal. You notice it in the meat first. Beef becomes more consistent, less mysterious. Cuts start looking intentional rather than opportunistic. Pork shows up more often, salted and smoked elsewhere, arriving ready to cook. Even the beans feel different, smaller, more uniform, less likely to surprise you with a stone someone missed during sorting. Historians still argue whether railroads improved food quality more than food variety, but sitting here chewing thoughtfully, it feels like both. Canned food begins creeping in too. Tomatoes in tins, fruit sealed months ago but still recognizable, condensed milk that transforms coffee into something almost luxurious. You watch someone add it slowly, reverently, like it's medicine. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some people distrusted canned food at first, convinced that anything sealed that tightly had to be unnatural or cursed. Then they tasted peaches in winter and never looked back. You realize how much time railroads save. No more waiting on local hunts or wagon deliveries that might never arrive. Predictability enters the kitchen. Menus don't become formal, but they become steadier. Chili tastes more like chili from one week to the next. Bread improves as better flour becomes available. Even desserts appear slightly more often, riding in on sugar shipments that don't cost a fortune anymore. The bartender moves differently now. There's less improvisation, more routine. He still adapts, but the stakes feel lower. Running out of food no longer means scrambling. It means waiting for the next train. One light joke floats by when someone says the railroad's the best cook in town, and the bartender doesn't argue. You also notice how this change affects the crowd. More families appear during daylight hours. Travelers linger less anxiously, knowing supplies are reliable. The saloon starts to feel less like a last resort and more like a choice. That shift changes behavior. People complain more, expectations rise. Progress has a way of doing that. Historians still argue whether railroads destroyed the rugged self, reliance of frontier towns, or simply replaced one form of dependence with another. Watching the plates go by, you can see both sides. The food is better, but it's no longer entirely local. The town eats what the schedule allows. You take another bite, smoother now, easier, and feel the edge dull just a little. The Wild West doesn't disappear when the trains arrive. It softens. And in that softening, saloon food becomes something closer to what you recognize today. Familiar, reliable, less heroic maybe, but far kinder to the teeth. You start paying attention to the coins now, because food out here isn't just about hunger. It's about arithmetic. Every plate, every bowl, every bite carries a quiet calculation behind it. You feel it when someone hesitates before ordering, fingers brushing a pocket, eyes flicking to the bar as if hoping prices might have changed since yesterday. One mainstream historical fact is that wages in the Wild West varied wildly depending on job, season, and luck, and food prices in saloons reflected that instability. A cowboy fresh off a long cattle drive might feel rich for a week. A miner between strikes might count pennies for months. Saloon meals adapt to both realities, offering portions that range from generous to barely. They're depending on what people can pay. You notice how pricing isn't always posted. It doesn't need to be. Regulars know what things cost, and newcomers learn quickly. Beans are cheap. Bread is cheaper. Meat costs more, especially when supplies are thin. Chili sits somewhere in the middle, a reliable option when you want value and warmth. Historians still argue whether saloon owners intentionally kept food prices low to attract drinkers, or whether margins were simply too thin to raise them much, but the balance is delicate either way. Portions tell stories too. A full bowl means business is good, or the owner wants to keep people around. A skimpy scoop signals scarcity or caution. You watch someone get a smaller serving than usual and see the flicker of concern cross their face. Out here, portion size is information. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some people judged a town's prosperity entirely by the thickness of its stew. You also notice who eats big and who eats carefully. Wealthier patrons order meat without hesitation. They take seconds if offered. Others stretch bread, Dunk it slowly, make a bowl last longer than it should. No one comments. Hunger teaches discretion. One light joke drifts by when someone says the beans are inflation-proof, and laughter follows because everyone knows what that means. Credit exists, but it's fragile. A trusted regular might eat now and pay later, but that trust is earned slowly and lost quickly. Miss a payment, and suddenly the menu shrinks for you. Historians still argue whether informal credit systems helped stabilize frontier communities or simply trapped people in cycles of debt. And sitting here, watching careful bites and counted coins, you can see both sides at once. Food also becomes charity in disguise. A larger portion slipped to someone down on their luck. A meal quietly comped in exchange for work or information. The saloon doesn't advertise generosity, but it practices it selectively. Hunger is visible here. Ignoring it entirely would be bad for business and worse for reputation. You finish your meal feeling aware, not just full. Every bite you took represented time worked, risk taken, or luck earned. Out here, food is currency translated into calories. And as the night moves on, you realize that what's on your plate is never just about taste. It's about survival math, solved one meal at a time. You start to notice the order of things now, not written anywhere, but felt. Drink first, food second. Sometimes food only exists to justify the drink, like a polite excuse everyone agrees not to question. The saloon may smell like chili and coffee, but its heartbeat is still alcohol, and everything edible quietly orbits that fact. One mainstream historical fact is that alcohol sales made up the vast majority of a saloon's profits, with food often operating at low margins or even at a loss. Meals aren't the product, they're the facilitator. You see it in how quickly a plate appears once a glass is ordered, and how slowly it arrives if you don't. No one says anything. The system speaks for itself. You watch a man order whiskey, then hesitate, then nod toward the food like it's an afterthought. The bartender responds immediately, already reaching for a bowl. Eating gives drinking legitimacy. It says you're being responsible, even if you're not. Historians still argue whether saloons genuinely encouraged eating to reduce drunkenness, or whether food was simply another tool to keep people drinking longer, and the room feels like evidence for both at once. Salty food dominates for a reason. Pickles, cured meat, beans cooked hard and dry enough to beg for a swallow. You take a bite and feel the familiar thirst bloom. This isn't accidental. One light joke floats by when someone mutters that the cook must be paid by the salt, and a few tired laughs follow because everyone understands the game. You notice how rarely people come in just to eat. It happens, but it's not the norm. Eating alone feels incomplete here, like clapping with one hand. Food and alcohol are socially fused. Even coffee, bitter and strong, often arrives after or alongside whiskey, not instead of it. The saloon doesn't push sobriety. It manages excess. There's also a rhythm to how food slows drinking without stopping it. Beans and bread weigh you down just enough to keep you from tipping over too early. Chili warms and grounds you. It's not temperance, it's pacing. Historians still argue whether this balance reduced violence or simply extended it across longer evenings. But from where you're sitting, the extension feels intentional. You notice that when food runs out, the night accelerates. Voices get louder, movements get sharper. The absence of food removes the buffer. The bartender knows this too, keeping pots filled as long as possible. Hunger makes people impatient. A full stomach buys time. You take another slow bite, aware now of your place in the cycle. Eat, drink, eat again. Stay longer than planned. Spend more than intended. The saloon isn't hiding this. It doesn't need to. Participation is voluntary, and hunger makes you willing. As the room hums around you, you realize food here isn't about choice. It's about choreography. Every bowl and plate moves people where the saloon needs them to be, and most nights no one minds at all. You start to feel the geography in the food now, as if the land itself is seasoning your plate. The West isn't one place, no matter how often stories flatten it into a single dusty blur. Each town, each region, quietly reshapes what the saloon serves, based on climate, culture, and whatever can survive the journey to the door. One mainstream historical fact is that regional variation in saloon food was significant, shaped by local agriculture, immigrant populations, and access to trade routes. In cattle country, beef dominates. In mining towns tucked into mountains, preserved foods and stews take over. Near borders, flavors shift again, pulling in spices and techniques that feel warmer, brighter, more complex. You imagine yourself moving town to town. In Texas, chili reigns. Thicker, spicier often meat forward. In California, you see more fresh produce when available, influenced by Mexican and Asian cooking. In the northern plains, bread gets heavier, stews get denser, and meals focus on warmth and calories. Historians still argue whether these regional differences were sharply defined or blurred constantly by migration. But the taste changes are real enough to notice. You also feel the environment shaping portion size. Harsh climates demand more food. High-altitude towns serve heavier meals. Hot, dry regions lean into salt and preservation. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some travelers claimed they could tell where they were by tasting the beans alone, which sounds exaggerated until you've eaten enough of them to notice the subtleties. You notice how even pickles change. Different brines, different vegetables, different levels of patience. Bread shifts too, cornbread here, wheat there, flatbreads elsewhere. These aren't aesthetic choices. They're answers to local problems. One light joke passes when someone says the stew tastes like mountain weather. And it somehow makes sense. Food becomes a shorthand for place. You eat and understand where you are without needing a map. Historians still argue whether a unified Western cuisine ever truly existed, but sitting here, tasting the land through the saloon's offerings, you suspect the answer is no. And that's the point. The West feeds you in dialects, not a single language. You finish your plate feeling traveled without moving, aware that every saloon you enter rewrites the menu just enough to keep you guessing. Out here, food doesn't just fill you up. It tells you where you stand. You realize somewhere between bites that a lot of what you thought you knew about Wild West food came from movies, not meals. The image in your head, perfect steaks, endless whiskey, men laughing loudly with full plates, starts to crumble the longer you sit here. The reality is quieter, thinner, and far more practical. Myth tastes different when you chew it. One mainstream historical fact is that popular depictions of saloons in film and television exaggerated both abundance and variety. Most real saloons operated on narrow margins, serving repetitive, utilitarian food designed to keep people functional, not impressed. You don't see massive spreads or gleaming plates. You see beans again, bread again, chili again. Not because imagination failed, but because repetition works. You catch yourself smiling at how wrong the myths are. Cowboys didn't stride in for towering steaks every night. They ate what was there. Sometimes that meant a good meal. Sometimes it meant scraping the pot. Historians still argue whether Hollywood myths were based on rare boomtown exceptions or pure fantasy, but either way, the average saloon meal was far less dramatic. You also unlearn the idea that everyone ate together joyfully. Meals are often quiet, focused. People eat fast, then linger over drinks. Food is practical, not social glue by default. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some visitors from the East complained the food felt joyless, which says more about expectations than cooking. You notice how myth erases hunger. Stories skip the waiting, the counting of coins, the uncertainty. Sitting here, you feel all of that. One light joke drifts by when someone says the only thing unlimited out here is patience, and even that's running low. Historians still argue whether myth making helped preserve frontier history or distorted it beyond recognition. But as you finish your meal, you appreciate the truth more. It's rougher, yes, but also more human. The West wasn't fed by fantasy, it was fed by whatever worked. You wipe your hands and let the myths fall away. What's left is quieter, tougher, and far more interesting. You start noticing patterns now, not just in the food, but in who seems satisfied and who never quite is. Hunger doesn't hit everyone equally in the saloon. Some people eat like this is routine, almost boring. Others eat like it might be the last reliable meal they see for a while. Who actually ate well in the Wild West turns out to be a much narrower group than the stories suggest. One mainstream historical fact is that consistent access to good food in frontier towns was largely tied to stable income and social position. Saloon owners, successful merchants, established ranchers, and certain professionals ate better and more often than transient workers. They could afford meat regularly. They didn't have to stretch bread or nurse a bowl for an hour. You can spot them by how relaxed they are around food. You watch one man order without looking at prices, barely glancing at the plate when it arrives. He eats slowly, almost lazily. Food is not urgent for him. Contrast that with the miner nearby, whose meal is small, deliberate, calculated. Every bite is paced. Bread is torn into careful pieces. Chili is eaten slowly to make it last. Hunger teaches different manners depending on how familiar it is. Cowboys fall somewhere in the middle. When money's good, they eat like kings. When it's gone, they disappear or survive on the cheapest options available. Historians still argue whether cowboys were generally well fed compared to other laborers. But watching the way they eat, sometimes ravenously, sometimes cautiously, you realize how seasonal their comfort really is. Women connected to food work often eat better than outsiders expect. Cooks, boarding house operators, and their families have access to ingredients before they're served. Not abundance, but consistency. That matters more than luxury. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some of the best-fed people in frontier towns were children of cooks, which feels quietly fair. Then there are those who rarely eat well at all, drifters, the injured, people between jobs. They rely on charity disguised as generosity. A larger scoop, a free bowl, leftovers quietly push their way. One light joke floats by when someone says the stew tastes better when it's free, and the laughter that follows is softer, more understanding. Historians still argue whether frontier towns were more charitable or more ruthless than eastern cities, but in the saloon, you see both at once. Food reveals status without announcing it. Plates tell the truth even when people don't. You finish your meal aware now that eating well out here isn't about bravery or toughness. It's about stability. And stability in the Wild West is rarer than gold. You feel the shift before you can name it, like a draft through a door that hasn't fully opened yet. The saloon is still here. The food still comes out hot. But something is thinning, stretching, changing shape. This is the slow decline of the classic saloon meal. Not a collapse, not a dramatic ending, just a quiet fade as the world reorganizes itself around new rules. One mainstream historical fact is that by the early 20th century, a combination of changing laws, urbanization, and shifting social norms began to alter the role of saloons across the American West. As towns grew more stable, restaurants, cafes, and hotels appeared, offering food without the expectation of alcohol. Suddenly, the saloon no longer held a monopoly on hot meals. You notice how menus start shrinking instead of expanding. Fewer pots, less variety. Food becomes more standardized, less improvisational. Chili tastes the same everywhere now, which feels comforting and disappointing at the same time. Historians still argue whether this standardization improved quality or erased local character. But sitting here, you miss the unpredictability already. Temperance movements loom quietly in the background. You hear whispers about regulations, closing times, licenses. Food that once existed to justify drinking now feels awkwardly exposed. If alcohol is restricted, what happens to the meals built around it? Some saloons pivot, leaning harder into food. Others don't adapt fast enough. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some saloon owners tried rebranding as lunchrooms. swapping whiskey for coffee and hoping no one noticed the difference. You sense the energy change in the room. Meals feel shorter. People don't linger the way they used to. Eating becomes something you do before moving on, not a reason to stay. One light joke passes when someone says the stew's getting respectable, and the laughter that follows has an edge of mourning. Historians still argue whether prohibition killed the saloon outright or merely transformed it into something else, but from where you're sitting, it feels like both. The old rhythm, eat, drink, linger, loses its pulse. Food alone can't hold the room the way it once did. You take your time with the last bites, aware that you're tasting the end of an era, not because the food is gone, but because its role has changed. The saloon meal no longer anchors frontier life. It becomes background noise, then memory. As the plates are cleared, you feel a strange quiet settle in. Progress doesn't slam doors. It just leaves them open long enough for the warmth to escape. You don't notice the echoes at first, because they're wrapped in familiarity. A bowl set on a bar, a plate slid across wood. Something salty arriving just in time to make you thirsty again. Long after the frontier fades and the saloon as you know it thins into memory, the food refuses to disappear. It adapts. It waits. It survives the same way it always has. One mainstream historical fact is that many elements of saloon food culture carried forward into modern bars, diners, and casual restaurants. Chili becomes a staple across the country. Pickled eggs still sit in jars behind some bars, daring the curious. Free snacks, pretzels, peanuts, popcorn, quietly inherit the role of the old free lunch, salty enough to keep drinks flowing. You've seen this before. You just didn't know where it came from. You picture a modern bar now, dim lights, worn wood, a low hum of conversation. Someone orders wings, someone else gets nachos. Heavy, salty, shared food designed to anchor you in place. Historians still argue whether modern bar food is a direct descendant of saloon meals or simply a parallel solution to the same business problem, but the resemblance is hard to ignore. Even the chili survives almost unchanged, thick, forgiving, designed to be made in bulk and loved by people who don't ask too many questions. You smile at that because it feels right. A quirky tidbit is that many competitive chili recipes trace their roots back to family methods passed down from frontier towns. Even if the story's been polished a little over time, you realize how much of this food lives in muscle memory rather than cookbooks. The instinct to eat something hearty while drinking. The comfort of warm, simple meals in noisy rooms. The understanding that food doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. One light joke drifts through your thoughts. Some recipes survived not because they were great, but because they refused to die. Historians still argue whether the Wild West deserves credit for shaping American comfort food, but sitting with this realization, the argument feels less important than the outcome. The saloon fed people when they needed it most. That need never really went away. You lean back now, full in that gentle, sleepy way that comes after understanding as much as eating. The room you've been imagining starts to soften at the edges. The clink of glasses fades. The smell of beans and coffee becomes a memory instead of a presence. And as the night deepens, everything slows. You remind yourself that all of this, every pot, every jar, every tough biscuit, was never about spectacle. It was about getting through another day, another night, another winter. The people who ate this food weren't trying to make history. They were trying to stay upright, stay warm, stay human. Your breathing evens out as the images drift past more slowly now. Swinging doors, a simmering pot, a shared table where no one asks too many questions. The Wild West doesn't shout as it fades. It settles like embers after a long fire. There's comfort in that. You let the last sounds dissolve, the last tastes fade, knowing you're safe, fed, and done traveling for tonight. The story has carried you far enough. Now it's time to rest.